I'd like to introduce you to our final speaker before dinner break and before moving on to the Fun Palace. Those of you who will be joining us in the Fun Palace.
Isn't Klaus on after this? Oh, this is Klaus? Oh.
Agency, algorithms, and a new form of aggression. And I take, everyone takes such a positive side of cybernetics, and I'm also very positive, but we have to see the dark side. And that is what I try to do. I will just talk about some basic concepts, and maybe I should look at this here. Anyway, some basic concepts, then I will talk about the kind of algorithms we live with, and then what we can do, and then I give some sort of a summary. And I hope the summary is somewhat more positive. Cybernetics started actually only with Norbert Wiener, but there was something much more earlier, namely in the 400 BC, there was a kind of a catalog of technology, and he found there are certain kinds of mechanisms that could not be explained. And that's where oil lamps, and later on it became water clocks and so on. So that's the way it started. And then 2,500 years later, we have the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was fueled by steam engines, among others. And the critical part is actually that regulator. That regulator was there. And you can say this is the cybernetic mechanism, but nobody recognizes. There were no theories about it. And this was just a technology. And I think at Norbert Wiener's time, objectively speaking, he didn't invent circularity. There were lots of several basic mechanisms already in the industry. There were lots of things already there. But what he did is he actually developed the mathematics. And that's where it started with the issue of self-reference. And
Excellent, self-reference.
Okay. And this is distorted. But the point is actually that he started with the issue of eigenvalues. That means a function that applies on a lot of things and always ends up with the same kind of value. The square root, whatever number you have, if you repeatedly, it ends up number 1. The next thing was actually to apply this to circle mechanisms. And the circle mechanism is again an eigenfunction, but there is a perturbation. So the perturbation is regulated away in favor of some desirable output. Norbert Wiener, in one of the famous documents that he always carried around and didn't show anyone, was a yellow folder, and he had their ideas of, for example, goal-seeking missiles and all of these kind of things. So it's very military. But the point was actually, it was based on the issue of servo mechanisms, which we know from a lot of things. And so they are adaptive to the environmental disturbances. Ross Ashby took this thing one step further, and he said, well, maybe we could change the nature of the mechanism. And he talked about self-organization. That means you have a set of organizations or set of structures, and as soon as the organism reaches the possibility of the difficulty function, or change the organization, or change the algorithms. So thereby making machines that are not easily predictable, because the number of algorithms that could be stored, well, they were finite with these experiments, but that was very difficult to predict. So that we know, of course, from Maturana, and Maturana was a very different idea, but it's a different kind of circularity than one of production. The idea that a network of components produces the very components that are part of the network that produces them. This is something that is very difficult technologically to reproduce, but maybe in some sense it is. That's one thing. But then Hans von Förster, in my opinion, Hans von Förster, how should I say, psychologized cognitivized cybernetics by saying the observer is in fact the one who, something is missing, and I hope that doesn't continue. Anyway, there's supposed to be a loop within the observer construction. The point is that the first order of cybernetics deals with, according to him, with the description of what is outside, and the second order of cybernetics describes the outside plus the observer. So in some sense, he made it cognitive. And also, a big complaint I have is that he deals with description. And he said, in fact, the logic of the world is the logic of description of the world. As if description was meant.
That's a good one.
And then Ashby, on the other hand, he had a very different notion. Namely, for him, a cybernetician was kind of an activist, and a designer of possible machines. And he said always that cybernetics is the study of all conceivable systems that one can construct, and whether they function or whether they cannot be built is kind of secondary. So for him, I think the issue of design is key, and that's sympathetic for me, because I am, by history, a designer. So, now, I want to just say that we're talking quickly about circularities here, and so many things, loops, and I think one should really separate what kind of loops we're talking about. So, for example, we need to distinguish the kind of the objects like the oil lamps and the regulator that have the quality of maintaining themselves. That doesn't mean that they're circular. By theory, yes, but not by observation. We know a biological system, us, we maintain a lot of things, but we are not aware of circularities. So then the next level, if you want, of circularity is one of explaining it, verbally explaining it, narratives. And we talk about positive and negative feedback. But these are verbal descriptions which are nice and help us understand certain kind of things. But I think the main starting point of more serious cybernetics began actually with self-referential mathematical descriptions. That is a very simple one, and including the law of forms, where the self-reference is critical. That means the operand and the operator is related by a function and reproduces itself. And then we have to look at the kind of algorithms that we can construct based on that. And finally, the networks of algorithms. But let me go to the second concept that is very important. And you have to remember, you probably know that all, but I do think I would like to make it clear. An algorithm, well-defined, unambiguous, and detailed instructions that were then implemented to determine the recursive computational practices that transformed a given set of data into another set of data. If you want a computer, it's just run by algorithms. And they are very determined. That means whenever you have to say a starting point, you end up with the particular starting point that it is programmed for. So I think algorithms are important and derive actually from the mathematical description. I would say any mathematical description, once it is specific enough and doesn't leave any loose ends, becomes an algorithm. And algorithms can be very simple, like multiplication, or an aptitude test, intelligence test, or a statistics. You have a set of data, and you get a result, and in between is an algorithm taking care of that, or bank teller machines. There are mechanisms that are algorithmically determined, depending on what kind of data they are accepting, they come to predictable results. And so I think they can be very complex, we know that. And I think I will talk about that a little later. But the point, it has to be that algorithms are human artifacts. They don't grow on trees, and they represent human conceptions. Without that, there are no algorithms. So I think algorithms are designed by someone that one has to hold them accountable for, if you want, but they are given assignments from corporations as to what to do, implement these algorithms, and in a way that works for them. And that's the reason why I ask you for what and who it works. Well, it is usually there is some sort of a user that is connected with the model. One can say black box, but it is not quite a black box. It is programmed by an algorithm. And I want to be sure that you know that an algorithm is like an instruction for a machine, and it is a human creation, and it is not there in the world. The second one, to me, that's very important, is human agency. I'm very uncertain about, we talked about anything beyond his fundamental starting point of a distinction. An agent is one who is capable of making a distinction and then acting on it. Now, the act of making a distinction is already an act. And there are lots of theories that people respond to this type of stimulus or that stimulus. This is already reducing the human being to a beginning of a machine. You have to make a distinction first, and then you can act on it. To me, I think agency implies choices, actions, movements, automation, whatever. The point is, again, that to keep that in mind, the step is to first make a distinction, and without this distinction, you cannot make a choice. And then you act on it and everything else follows. So, to me, this is very important. How do you know? How do we know that someone makes a distinction? How do you know that someone is an actor? How do you understand someone else's understanding? You can't. How do you know what someone else thinks? We can't. We don't know. We can't open their brains, and even if we do, we won't find anything. But the point is actually, agency per se is not observable. But agency is revealed by agents giving account to other agents as to what they were thinking, what they were doing, what their intentions are. So I think, to me, agency is not a physical phenomenon. Agency is a phenomenon that is basically social. That means where certain kinds of things are articulated and, if you want, negotiated, and agency is established actually in words, not in the mind.
I think what I don't make sure that you're not confusing the two kinds of concepts, accountability and responsibility. Responsibility is either assigned from an authority or assumed for something to do.
The parent assumes responsibility for their children, but if you are hired, then someone tells you, you are in charge of this. This is responsibility. That's not accountability. Accounts may be offered, either voluntarily, when you propose an action, or they may be requested by someone to give so that you can give an account, and you can either explain it, offer it, negotiate it. You can also conceivably refusing to give an account, which in the sense is also a claim of authority. You can't, well, anyway. So there are several movements, several accounts, and I think I based my notions of G. Wright Mills through 1940 by studying the power elite in the United States. And you know, this is again one of those metaphors that as soon as you talk about power, you talk actually about physics, or you import physical metaphors. And he was the one who systematically went away from that, and he said, well, what the power in meetings is how do you explain the action. And he came to the distinction that there are these five kinds, and one can also find more final distinctions. But the justification is a claim that one has acted something, proposed something, and it has virtue. Most proposals in board meetings are in fact including this already. In fact, we want to produce this kind of phenomena as a benefit. So there are already the accounts of agency there. Apologies admit actually agency. You have done something dumb, and you promise not to do it again. And explanations admit that you maybe have not been very clear or not sensitive enough to your audience, and you spoke a different language and you didn't know that they couldn't understand it. But then you can explain it and fix it, so to speak. Excuses basically deny agency. That means saying, I'm not responsible for that, I cannot be blamed. And then there's scapegoating when one say, I'm not responsible, but this guy is. So the point is actually that agency is established within these, and maybe some more, accounts that people give in response to either requests or without requests. So now it is very important again to come back to agency, to algorithms. Algorithms do not have agency. Why? You can't hold them responsible. I think this is important. We often confuse machines as agents, and we say, the computer tells me that. No, the computer doesn't tell you anything. The point is actually that there's a fundamental difference between agency, which has to do with language, and you cannot establish language or agency without language. There are lots of theories that are determinist, and they unilaterally, I would say, they are unilaterally denying that there is agency. Animism, the belief that natural objects, stones can hit you. It's a bogus. Stones can't. Stones have no agency. Or volcanoes want to ruin the island. Nothing of that sort. Religious determinism. God tells you so. Or Rule Natur, etc. The actor-actor network theory. I don't know if you know that. It's a sociological theory saying we should not look at human agency. They are just like any machine. They are physical exertion of things, and everything else is meaningless. Or Foucault. Foucault is kind of a discourse analyst who says, well, the discourse of a certain area determines how you write, how you think, and what you do. That is determinism. There is no agency. Roberto Maturano is the belief in structural determinism. It's also, there is no agency. This is kind of a very common description saying, we have the illusion that we control our thoughts and decisions. In fact, our body's internal systems make us decisions. Before those decisions come into our thinking and feeling, we have all the illusion that, in the sense that we subjectively perceive things. In essence, our thinking and feeling is superficial illusionary process, helpful in many ways as an additional interface for the body and the world, but superficial and underlying causal internal processes. I would not doubt this, except it's meaningless. The point is actually that we act as agents, we hold each other accountable for it. If you go to a court, you can't say, oh, my thoughts of stealing came automatically and so that was not, at least for most people, it was not. The point is actually agency is a social construct. It's not physical, and he may be right, I do not know. And lots of theorists say that is an illusion. Free will is an illusion that doesn't exist. Maybe it doesn't exist. That's not the point. It exists socially. Agency is a social construct. In criminal court, agency is actually what is established in some form or the other. And we elect officials in order to act on our behalf, and also agents may lie. And to me, that's also interesting. agents may lie, and right now we have great experiences in the United States. But if nobody can show that it's a lie, and everyone agrees with what it is, then it is what it is. So, I mean, it's not a question of truth or falsity, it's a question of social acceptability. And you know, being disengineered is also a social construction. The judgment that someone lied and to deceive you. From a cybernetic point of view, and this goes now seemingly on a automatic thing, but if you think of loops, they are not causal. They are reflexive, and maybe I just go quickly through. This seems to be automatically run. Someone, you know, good social psychologist said, when we talk, always have in mind already what account we would give if someone asks us. In fact, we cannot even talk to someone else without that phenomenon. We have an understanding of others and also an understanding of what they might say if they hear us saying that. So that's automatic. Let me now go to the other concept. And oppression usually is associated with living in an authoritarian regime where discrimination of civil rights is denied, discrimination between different populations is rampant, etc., etc. Well, Max Weber, sociologist, he said that this is often unnoticed oppression, largely because the privileged class, the dominant class, sees no problem in talking about the minority as inferior. And that you can look yourself in the United States or Nazi Germany, whatever, that is the case. The ruling class has no place for oppression because they are the ruling class. And I'm saying that as class, but simply superior in some form. I would say that oppression resides in with the explainable experience of being entrapped and fears of lack of resources to exercise human agency. You're trapped. You cannot do certain kinds of things. And this is manifest in the inability or unwillingness. By inability, I mean they say they can't do it. They have no basis for examining where the oppression comes from. Or are unwilling, that means careless, they take it for granted. So I think to being oppression has something to do with being entrapped and unable to exercise agency. And the blind compliance seems to be the only acceptable alternatives. Now, okay, now I want to just ask myself, what do we do with agents? Now, one can say normally we interact as human beings with our just ordinary human, on an ordinary human scale. But the first and oldest perhaps technology is something that extends certain senses. For example, writing. Now that is not particularly cybernetic, but I think to me that is very important. Writing is very convenient. And you could have your thoughts and so on a piece of paper or on stones. But the social consequences are enormous. And we know that writing, the invention of writing, was a source of empire building. How come? Well, writing is more durable than verbal communication, more detached from the source. There doesn't need to be an author, it can be on pieces of paper. The Egyptian empires were entirely built on writing, and that is a social consequence of the minor convenience of putting pieces of paper. And that is, you can see similar things with the telephone. The telephone was also a mere extension beyond, let's say, human voice. You put in a wire and you talk to a lot of people, and that's fine. Nobody has a complaint with that. However, the consequences of that social consequences are enormous. Distribution of activities, coordination beyond local things. Actually, I was thinking also the history of the United States when Washington's army were relying on horse observers that came and told them where the enemies are, etc., etc. Well, that was a different kind of war than now, where we just made a telephone call, observe, and whatever. So the life was totally different, and the apparent convenience of just extending the ability to communicate from the direct human contact to a wire, that made a great difference, and we accept that research. And email and social networks, but that is a further extension. You know, it's good to have friends, there's no problem. Even though what kind of friends is another issue. The thing is, it changes the political nature of politics. That the Arab Spring is a result, basically, of the ability to communicate and coordinate on the internet. The next thing is kind of this amplification of routine human efforts. And I'm saying, for example, calculators, spell checkers, very convenient. And I think there is no problem using that. And you have no, I mean, for you, it's fine. But what you're doing is actually you feed an enormous industry by the very fact of doing this. And I have to, when you click and say, I like it, that is so immediately a part of the data that you contribute for an institution of which you have very little influence and no knowledge. But the amplification is another phenomena that when you think of the amplification issue, that once you have spell checkers, once you have search engines, you forget or you unlearn the ability to do this yourself. Like the GPS is a good example. When you have a GPS, you don't need to know what the environment is like. You're relying on it. You're perfectly independent. So there's an institutionalization of that phenomena, which you don't notice, or minimally only. The next thing is, to me, is replacing occupational routines. The teller machine. Well, we know what a vector is, and you can still have the same kind of conceptions. You can maybe go to the machine and say, you have to identify yourself, and you have to get the money, you have to know your account or whatever. But that's very, very human and cool. So there's an institutionalization of that phenomena, which you don't notice, or minimally only. The next thing is, to me, is replacing occupational routines. The teller machine. Well, we know what a vector is, and you can still have the same kind of conceptions. You can maybe go to the machine and say, you have to identify yourself, and you have to get the money, you have to know your account or whatever. But that's very, very human and cool. But or if you consider that customer service calls, and you know what the nuisance that is, if you want to get an answer and get to a chain of things, it is we are systematically the next thing is, to me, is replacing occupational routines. the teller machine. Well, we know what a back teller is, and you can still have the same kind of conceptions. You can maybe go to the machine and say, you know, you have to identify yourself, and you have to get the money, you have to know your account or whatever. But that's very, very human and cool. But or if you consider that customer service calls, and you know what the new system is, if you want to get an answer and you get to a chain of things, it is just, we are systematically replacing actually jobs by algorithms.
Thank you very much. I'll just note that it is 5:37. I don't want to shut down any conversation like that, but just so that you know, again, Fun Palace Bus is leaving at 6:30. Some people may choose to run and eat. Some people may want to talk now. Remember, food truck at Fun Palace if you want to wait and eat there, and chances to eat in English Bay. Make your decisions as you will. Would you like to take some questions, Klaus?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I can give us that.
Thank you for that. So I find that it's a very elegant argument.
You gotta get back to the room.
But I kind of want to zoom in on
Drop
the
stuff off.
attribution of agency as a
Leave it
really
like that. I guess you don't want to go down the
distinction. Does that in some way relegate the rest of nature to an algorithm?
No, exactly, it takes it away. Because an agent is someone who makes distinctions and choices, has choices. But
Is
you
that in some
can, of
way-
course, you have an agent, an agent could be designing algorithms.
Right, but does that attribution in some way remove agency from the natural world, from animals, from?
I would say agency distinguishes human beings from animals, yes.
Go back to Weber.
And to me, it is very clear that this is a social phenomenon. And in words and arguments,
Look at
you can find
sociology.
out how someone thinks, whether someone is in fact has made a
Oh,
decision
boy.
or followed that some sort of a program, whatever. That has to come up in interaction, and it's a social phenomenon. And I think again, the courts of law, they establish very carefully whether you have had the ability to do something, whether you are capable of doing this. And this is all a question of, have that person agency.
Right.
Beyond, let's say, human voice, you put in a wire and you talk to a lot of people, and that's fine. Nobody has a complaint with that. However, the consequences of that, social consequences, are enormous. It's a distribution of activities, coordination beyond local things. Actually, I was thinking also the history of the United States when Washington's army were relying on horse observers that came and told them where the enemies are, etc., etc. Well, that was a different kind of war than now, where we just made a telephone call, observe, and whatever. So the life was totally different. And the apparent convenience of just extending the ability to communicate from the direct human contact to a wire, that made a great difference. And we accept that as such. And email and social networks, but that is a further extension. It's good to have friends. There's no problem. Even though what kind of friends is another issue. The thing is, it changes the political nature of politics. That the Arab Spring is a result, basically, of the ability to communicate and coordinate on the internet. The next thing is kind of this amplification. Of routine human efforts. And I'm saying, for example, this is crazy. Calculators, spell checkers, very convenient. And I think there is no problem using that. And you have no, for you, it's fine. But what you're doing is actually you feed an enormous industry by the very fact of doing this. And I have to, this is great. Anyway, so you, when you click and say, I like, that is so immediately a part of the data that you contribute for an institution of which you have very little influence and no knowledge. But the amplification is another phenomena that when you think of the amplification issue, that once you have spell checkers, once you have search engines, you forget, although you unlearn the ability to do this yourself. Like the GPS is a good example. When you have a GPS, you don't need to know what the environment is like. You're relying on it. You're perfectly dependent on it. So there's an institutionalization of that phenomena, which you don't notice, or minimally only. The next thing is, to me, is replacing occupational routines. The teller machine. Well, we know what a bank teller is, and you can still have the same kind of conceptions. You can maybe go to the machine and say, you have to identify yourself, and you have to get the money, you have to know your account, or whatever. So that's very, very human and cool. But or if you consider that customer service calls, and you know what the news system is, if you want to get an answer and you get to a chain of things, we are systematically replacing actually jobs by algorithms. And so to me this is I think a major social shift that we often don't notice. We might tolerate it as a nuisance. And then there are self-organizing population data surveys. This is, I wish we can put together. I get rid of this waste class. No, that I want this. Next one. This one? Yeah. There are huge mechanisms that deal with governance of people. When you want to have a loan, you apply and you are evaluated for your credit score. But that is not enough. There was actually a law made that you shouldn't be credit score used as criteria. So the algorithms bypass that, depending on where you work, where you live. If you have a zip code of an area that has low rate of compliance with money, you don't get a loan. When you have a name that sounds like black, you don't get a loan. So we are increasingly dependent on mechanisms that self-organize themselves and to produce actually what I could call normal curves. And the normal curve, I should have thought here, but it has two ends, one extreme and the other. And most businesses thrive on the middle. Large quantity sales, big money, etc., it's all in the middle. And the outsiders, outliers, are completely ignored. Now, if you are a minority, and if you fall in there, and you cannot get a loan, and you cannot get a job, this produces actually precisely the thing, it amplifies precisely the differences. Think about intelligence, that to me is always very important. Intelligence tests. Well, there are intelligence people are not. And as you know, there is the so-called bell curve, and it turns out that the black population is on the lower end. And so if you know as an employer that all black people are on the lower end, why would you hire them? And why would you get them in fact a scholarship? So the more you know about the statistics, the more these differences are amplified rather than reduced. And you can continue that enormously. For example, another example. in Washington, D.C., the mayor of Washington said, found out or was told that the education system is pretty bad. To improve on it, he decided to make tests and see how the teachers do. And so he developed that an algorithm and found that about 350 teachers, they don't improve over time. Well, and there was one case that I read about. She was an exceptional teacher. She was, parents liked her a lot. She was nominated as the most outstanding teacher in the school. And she fell back and she was fired. Now, luckily, because she was so good, the superintendent got her a job in a private school. But the point is actually, she was teaching the underprivileged students, and as a result, she didn't get these high enough the scores, and she was an exceptional teacher, but the algorithm told them not to do. Recidivism. In New Jersey, a judge wanted to release a prisoner who was a model prisoner, and everyone said that he is perfect, he should be released, and everyone agreed with that. And then came an algorithm, no, you can't do that. So then comes the judge and said, how come? Please explain to me the algorithm. No, proprietary. So what can you do? Now, and I would say that the issue of agency enters. He could actually ignore it and say, I don't give a damn, and then release the prisoner, or he could yield, comply. Now, it would be difficult actually, when you think of it, to deny the algorithm, because if he later on is on record to have denied it, he will have great difficulties. As a result, you yield and you keep a good person in prison. So I think the self-organizing population data, which you sometimes get when you buy a book, and then you get all the books that are related and that you can also be interested in, that is what is sometimes helpful, no doubt, but it also ruins the differences in the population. So I think the next level, if you want, of algorithmization is some kind of big autonomous systems like the electric net in the US, or stock market, or military defense, etc., etc. And they're so big that you don't really know how they work. You experience them when something goes wrong. When something goes wrong. When the electricity fails in New York, and nobody knows how to fix it. But that is where the algorithms impinge on us, but only when they fail. However, to me, the critical part is that when you look at this kind of hierarchy, there is an increased loss of human agency and an increased reliance, willingness, I would say, on machines that do all kinds of things unlike human beings. And I would say that is an increase in oppression. And it is a function of, I would say, the surrender of agency. It's not so that the machines take away your agency. I think we as human beings surrender. Think about how often that happens when you go to the supermarket and you find there's something wrong, and then the cashier says, my computer says so. That's submission. And I think the large institutions stand on the back of just minor tokens of benefits that we simply freely accept. So I think this is to be, it's a bit frightening, and I think the cybernetics is heavily involved in this. What accounts for this kind of algorithmization? I don't want to go through all of it, but one of them is kind of a misconception of what algorithms do. Another one is a lack of transparency. transparency, who knows where they are? You don't know where they're located, you don't know who promotes it, who designed it. It's very difficult. Or the hopelessness I think that much of system science is actually thrives on how hopeless it is, how complex the systems are. They're often very simple, actually, but one has to make an effort. And the decoding of the algorithms of an existing machine is very difficult. So I think, to me, that is I think, the big danger. So to me, algorithms, the big misunderstanding is that algorithms are more intelligent than human beings, are more reliable, and inherently fair to everyone, and more efficient, and can deal with larger issues. I can give you examples where that seems to be. Like, for example, larger issues. Who could possibly look for a piece of literature and go within a few seconds to 20,000 documents? It's impossible. So there is an expansion of something that is worthwhile for us, no doubt. But is it intelligence? I would say no. Does it involve agency? I would say absolutely no. So I think these misconceptions result, I think, in my opinion, from the careless use of our own language. Maybe one of it is uncritically attributing intelligence to artificial intelligence, or machine learning to machine learning systems. What I said earlier, the systems that learn to find clues that predict a particular population and come up with names that sound black, or addresses in poor neighborhoods, and so on, you don't get them. Something. And on all of these kind of phenomena, these are not learning, these are adaptive machines. And so, and then the second point was that actually this is deferring judgment to mechanical devices. We often delegate our intelligence to mechanical devices. Or when we talk about computer literacy, where it is involving human beings, then we usually think only about someone who can handle the interface, and not the social consequences. And finally, we think of big data as giving a deeper understanding. Far from so. So I think not realizing that we are actually on the receiving, human beings are the receiving end, and get only token benefits for the huge benefits of big organizations, and society at large becoming increasingly efficient. So now what constitutes cybernetics could be? I think first of all, I would say debunking the belief in algorithms being intelligent. And naming basically agency back. I think I see, for example, several presentations, they talk too quickly about causal inferences, causal models, and as soon as we have causal models, we are replicating agency. So I think the narrative, just the specifications, one has to look at. No, I think I get there. So, and when these algorithms are inherently biased, I would say. Starting with the interest of the corporations that give the AI designers certain kind of jobs, continuing with the biases that the designers have, racial biases, religious biases, you name it. They're full of biases. And these biases are increasing, as I was saying, the divisions, the distinctions in society when we take them into account.
What about dating apps?
Now, objectively, there are some barriers against just debunking. And I think, to me, I think it was important to take this as a project, to debunk the false attribution of intelligence. One is that we have no way of, even the AI designers have no methodology to how to translate the narratives they get into algorithms. So to reverse that is even more difficult. But most algorithms, they are developed in teams over time. The narratives evolve, some are forgotten, then there are only small changes, and they're very difficult to trace. And finally, is that in a competitive world, algorithms tend to be proprietary. If you look at Google and so on, we don't know, and they will not tell us what kind of algorithm they have, mainly because they need to compete. So that is the second, the third part is kind of traditional. We talked a lot about black boxes. Usually one can say reverse engineering. I don't want to talk too much about it. This is often very costly. In practice, these complex algorithms, they are very difficult to re-engineer. Maybe one can look at particular pieces that are wrong, but it will not help us much. You know? So then the fourth one is it's a political move. It's demanding transparency. And there are some communities, for example, in New Jersey, there are several cities that say all algorithms that we as a city government use must be transparent to the public. You know? But that's a good starting point. But it is, if you want, that's a political move which is worth undertaking. But there are also barriers. You know? Corporations derive benefits from using it, they will not get it, and declare them proprietary. And as far as re-engineering is concerned, I'm sorry about this, but as far as re-engineering is concerned, you often have to, when you buy a piece of software, you have to sign that you would not re-engineer it. So there are heavy protections against that. That's it. So, and then I think one thing that is at the heart of my criticism, and that is actually a scientific issue. One objection or one difficulty one faces is that the dominant,
What's going on?
the dominant scientific claims of authority, of truth, is done by scientists, irrespective of the consequences. Science has no way. Science has no way of asking the consequences. I think I almost switched off with two topics. Now, I want to say the dominant scientific claims of authority for truth claims ignore the consequences. I'm often telling my colleagues, as soon as you in interviews have categories of what race you are, etc., that introduces bias. Because ultimately, even if there's a good intention, once you have the notion of black in there, or foreigner, or non-citizen, you can correlate with something else, and that produces all kinds of discrimination. I think one has to be extremely careful as a social scientist to do not just to find the truth, or not to explain, or what previously the speaker understand. That is unimportant. Maybe it's a step, but it's not enough. Understanding is not enough. One has to understand the consequences of publications, etc., etc. So then there's a difficulties. You can easily make a study and find correlations, but then how would you get from them to the consequences? Well, actually, that's what I hear many times. One has to ask the stakeholders. One has to see just how they would react to it. And that's not too easy. But I think we have to somehow do that. Yeah, and then the political and commercial institutions are often against it, but I would say much of scholarship fails to recognize the potential revolutionary aspect of cybernetics. And it's very happy to have found things and found circularities, but not understanding that it may be harmful. So now, in sum, I think we have to realize that historically, mechanisms of cybernetics have preserved, contained things, and are inherently conservative. Mainly because they're based on mechanisms, and mechanisms can never create anything outside for what they are built. So, I think this rapid proliferation systematically preserves human agency. And previously formed, this is a form of oppression, but the interesting part of it, there's no oppressor. And you can't ask the king or a governor or a dictator accountable for it. It's diffused. It's a form of oppression that we have never experienced in that way. So I think, and to me, it's not just the fault of the algorithm, it's a fault of us delegating in language the intelligence to others and submitting. And not willing to investigate what is it that they're telling us. So this, I think they are analog to positive feedback in the sense that once the development of certain kind of algorithms are, they grow and grow and multiply and get more and more interaction. And actually, cybernetics, even though it has narratively recognized positive and negative feedback, but it's rarely dealing with positive feedback of the kind that we experience. The explosion is a positive feedback. A runaway of inflation is a positive feedback. But this kind of a runaway technology has never been conceptualized. So to me, it's the most important part is that language is not a causal system. Language is a combinatorial system. There are infinite numbers of expressions one can create within a certain time. And they're all possible, except for one important constraint. I mean, they must be understood. You can talk gibberish, but unless it's understood, it has no validity. So, and I think we have to realize that this is a very different kind of cybernetics that is based in language has to recognize that whatever is happening, the reality we construct is mutually constructed, is enabled, and also enacted. So I think cybernetics has essentially failed, in my opinion, and about maybe traditional cybernetics, to fail to address the consequences of its own language. And we talk about circularities and as if they are outside of us. And that's, I think, it's very important. We talk always about things, about circularities and observers and observed systems, but not that we shape them. So I would say, now I have to say, make a course correction. I wanted to say we have to pursue kind of a discursive cyber-ethics, but we just over lunch we talked, and I have to say, a long time ago I read the Paul Freire's book on the pedagogy of the oppressed, and I read it at that time very differently. But now I realize that he was said oppressed should not either become oppressors or fight oppressors. They have to develop a pedagogy to get out of it, to be out of it. And I would like to change it. I would not advocate cyber ethics, but cyber pedagogy eliminates or reduces the issue of oppression. So, and I would simply say that language is so important, and we should realize that that is the domain in which we have to operate. And it has to be an interdisciplinary language. That means not one that is that's experts, cybernetic experts or whatever talk, but one that is that uses or relies on stakeholders of those that are affected by it. So I would say that this is, I would say the pedagogy of cybernetics has to really take the people into account, not the system. The system is secondary to the human constituents. I think it's a big mistake to talk about systems and systems maintenance without thinking what happened to the people. So I think to me that is a very critical element that we have to look at the people that constitutes the system. And there are good reasons for why they do this, and maybe bad reasons, but they can tell us why they are part of it. And the previous speaker has quoted me by saying that social organizations are networks of conversations that we start at some point. And that is our people. We have to deal with individuals that make up an organization. And so then in order to do that, we have to recognize there are at least two loops, both in language. One is proposing possibilities, meaning proposing possibilities in language, not any other things, and then being accountable for what we're proposing. And I would say prioritizing the voices of the constituents, and usually, that's another, some of the different topics, I kind of like it, that big systems ventricularize the individuals, basically make them say things they want them to say. When you think of big parties, Republican talks like no Republican, and that has to do with the Fox News and whatever. They don't talk about themselves. They cannot even talk about themselves. So I think it is important to go to the experience of the individuals within a particular kind of system. So I think we have to liberate, we have to liberate people from oppression as much as possible. And I think the important thing is to find a balance between we have to find a balance between meaningful agency and dispensable agency. I mean, there are certain kinds of routine things that are boring, and we want to get rid of them. We don't want to get engaged. For that, it is fine to have algorithms take over it, like clocks, like whatever. There are lots of phenomena, but we should not promote self-organizing systems, algorithms for their own sake, and not understand the consequences. So, I mean, I said here the discursive cybernetics, and I would now say the discourse with cybernetic pedagogy is one that has an interdisciplinary language. It's concerned with social realities, but the very social realities it creates, not the descriptions of it, what it does. So that is, I think, it. You heard, saw already that I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, no, there's a few books, there's a kind of,
I do.
I wanted to say out of it, but there are several books One is Ashby, who is ultimately a determinist, but who had the idea of having moved out of mathematics in ways that allow us to self-organizing system. The science of the artificial is also well known, but he is also dealing entirely with the design of algorithms. The next one is something that I like, very recently written, Weapons of Mass Destruction. And that shows you how algorithms systematically interfere with the social differentiation and enhance differences that otherwise would not come about. And the next one is a book of artificial unintelligence. And I recommend it to you. This is actually written by a programmer who realized that the algorithms that she was writing had actually nothing to do with human intelligence. Human beings learn differently than merely adapting the system. So, and the last one is actually, this is just down in print. This is a collection of essays about loving cybernetics. I have one of them in there. So that's it.
What's the slide? That's it?
That's it.
Okay.
I agree with most of, but not all of your arguments. And if we frame your arguments within the context of the conception of the rise of the technosphere, that whole sphere of human addition of activity and materiality that is now as great almost in mass and variety as the biosphere, then this is just one manifestation of how the technosphere has subsumed human agency. And that has manifestations not only in algorithm design and other things of that nature, but of the cultural appropriation of technological innovation, such as, if you like, driverless cars, which solve a North American myth or something, to which there is no particular issue to which it's trying to address. A lot of other technologies which fail to appreciate the energy and environmental impacts. AI will be, if it ever takes off, one of the biggest users of energy in the globe. And Google searches is already one of the biggest users of energy in the world. So we are on a trajectory through technology which is absolutely counter to the Anthropocene demands and exigencies of human existence at the moment.
Well, there is a difference, and I know I could have gone more deeper into other issues like energy, but the energy is not a question of agency. We need energy, and my point is actually that I would say that cybernetics has been a revolutionary technology, a revolutionary ideas 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and it has had very negative effects. I think I'm obligated to be sure that we don't continue to do the kind of things that are harmful for human beings.
I agree with you.
And so that I think we are obligated as a cyberneticians to be extremely careful, more than careful, being activists in finding ways of getting agency back.
Okay, Gerald, Jude, Mark.
Okay, it's really not a question, it's more an opportunity. Delia McNamara, who is a semi-regular visitor to these conferences, has been hired by Canberra State Government in Australia to actually be their cyber ethics lead. And her analysis is fairly similar to yours. And she's actually got the responsibility of trying to work with all the techies who are producing these algorithms to address it. And so it'd be really interesting to hear how that actually plays out in practice.
Well, I give you the reference, and I'm happy to explore that and see to that.
Jude.
Klaus, I think of Herbert Brun, and I think of how he was the rebel, and that I see a lot of Herbert, even though you haven't mentioned him, in your desires as you presented this today, and I don't know what else to say about that.
Next, Jude.
I mean, I'll say one more thing. And that is, it just popped up. And that is anti-communication. It is not gibberish. There's gibberish, there's a seduction, the language, and there's communication. And Brun's anti-communication was trying to speak to the ASC and did speak to many members of the ASC. I mean, he affected my life for big time. And I just think it's really interesting where you are.
I know a little bit about Herbert Brun, but I think the issue of language is not something he was that deeply. He also
He was all about language.
Says we live in language. It's very easy to say, but it's much more difficult to say when you make a statement, like for example declaring war, then the war comes, or when you I mean these are language acts, and language changes the reality. The reality we live in, repeat and act.
My point.
And so that is part of accepting algorithms, which I think we have to be very careful of. That's what I'm going to say.
Mark.
First, I just wanted to mention a possible addition to the book list, and the book is called Algorithms of Oppression by Sophia Noble.
I don't know it, but thank you, I will explore it.
She starts off with the racism and sexism that come about when one does search engine searches, and then takes off from there in some related aspects. And then I'm also just curious, I don't know if we can really resolve in this conversation, but the relation between structural determinism that Maturana talks about and agency. I'm just curious whether they're opposed or they're actually, those two books are in the same direction.
Well,
and having to do with the deniability of what people are doing when they create structures.
What are the two issues?
I would say structures have no agency.
Well,
structures are the result of many people interacting with each other, complying or agreeing, but ultimately it boils down to people interacting. Then the structures like
determinism,
architectural structures, they are just there. The social structures, if there are no people, they are not effective. I mean, they are not there unless people act on it. So you have the question.
I mean, you invoke Matt's favor, and I think it's interesting. I've been thinking that for critical thinking that it does help to look at social theory. And you know, Weber wrote about bureaucracy, and sometimes people misinterpret what he said. They said he talked about bureaucracy as being rational, and people think that's a good thing. But he did talk about the downside, that the rationality means it's rule bound, and algorithms are rules, right? And he talked about the iron cage of bureaucracy. So I think, you know, one thing that's happened is that we have this, you know, computerized, technologically enhanced version of bureaucracy, and that I think the critical thinking is to look at that wedding of bureaucracy with the technology and where it's recognized.
Well, that brings to mind a quote after thinking of whom. He's a Stanford theorist about understanding computers. I don't know, again, he said basically, artificial intelligence is like bureaucracy, whereas human intelligence is interaction. And it's true, because the ideal bureaucracy is, as you say, rational. It's, you have a calculus, and that can be easily transformed into an algorithm. And that's the reason why, in fact, so many bureaucracies get into the issue of algorithms and become algorithmized, and they're big machines. And you cannot really do very much about it, except that you could perhaps build other kinds.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
So I'm going to call it official, close to the official part of this session now.
Thank you.
But if people want to, well, it's on Klaus, if you want to keep conversation going.
No, you have the chance.
Yeah, I'm closing the official part, but I mean, people will do what they do. But this is the end of this official session. Thank you very much.